What if a single cannon blast could launch an empire, and a silent flower could bring it all to an end? The story of Portugal's military history isn't just about war, it's about discovery, ambition, resistance, and redemption. Let's take a quiet walk through centuries of battles that built a nation and the peaceful revolution that finally transformed it. In the 15th to 17th centuries, Portugal transformed itself from a small European kingdom into a formidable global power, driven by a mix of curiosity, commerce, and conquest. This period, known as the Age of Exploration, saw Portugal's military and naval forces at the heart of its ambitions. Using advanced maritime technology and strategic geographic knowledge, Portuguese explorers and soldiers ventured far beyond their borders, establishing trading posts, forts, and colonies across 3 continents. Their journey began along the West African coast, where Prince Henry the Navigator sponsored expeditions to chart new waters and claim territories. These missions weren't just peaceful discoveries, they were often accompanied by armed forces ready to engage in battle, if needed. Military strength played a critical role in securing access to valuable resources like gold, spices, and slaves. As Portuguese fleets reached the Indian Ocean, they faced fierce resistance from local rulers and rival trading powers. The Portuguese responded by using their superior naval artillery and fortified ships to seize control of key ports such as Goa in India and Malacca in Southeast Asia. These victories were achieved through carefully planned attacks, strategic sieges, and sometimes brutal enforcement. In Brazil, Portuguese military forces subdued native populations and defended the colony from French and Dutch intrusions. The empire grew rapidly, and with it, Portugal's reliance on a strong military to maintain order and dominance in distant lands. Their soldiers were not only warriors but also instruments of colonial control, often stationed far from home for years. These military campaigns, while expanding Portugal's reach, also brought about significant cultural exchange, forced conversions, and lasting impacts on the regions they conquered. Through disciplined naval power and calculated use of force, Portugal became a pioneer of global empire building, setting the stage for centuries of colonial history. The conquest of Ceuta in 1415 was a turning point in Portuguese history, marking the kingdom's first major overseas military campaign and the beginning of its empire. Ceuta, a fortified city located on the northern coast of Africa, was a key strategic and commercial hub, linking Mediterranean and Atlantic trade routes. At the time, it was controlled by Muslim rulers and known for its wealth, particularly from gold, spices, and the trans-Saharan trade. The young Portuguese king, João I, saw its capture as both a religious and economic opportunity. Alongside his sons Prince Henry the Navigator, Prince Duarte, and Prince Pedro, he organized a large-scale military expedition to seize the city. The Portuguese fleet, consisting of around 200 ships and 20,000 men, set sail in August 1415. The attack on Ceuta was swift and intense. Portuguese forces launched a coordinated land and sea assault, surprising the defenders. Despite fierce resistance, the city fell in a single day. The victory was celebrated as a great triumph. Ceuta became the first overseas possession of Portugal, and a symbol of Christian power over Islam in the Iberian Peninsula's ongoing reconquista efforts. It also provided a valuable base for further exploration and military ventures into Africa. However, holding Ceuta proved more difficult than capturing it. The city required a permanent garrison and constant supply from Portugal, draining resources and sparking ongoing clashes with surrounding Muslim forces. Still, the success emboldened Portugal to continue its military expansion along the African coast and into the Atlantic. The conquest of Ceuta wasn't just about territory, it was a calculated step toward maritime dominance. It set the tone for future campaigns and demonstrated that military force could open the door to wealth, trade, and influence far beyond Europe's shores. The Portuguese colonial wars, fought between 1961 and 1974, were a series of intense and protracted military conflicts that took place in Portugal's African colonies Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau. These wars were driven by growing nationalist movements in the colonies, inspired by global waves of decolonization and the call for self-determination. Portugal, under the authoritarian Estado Novo regime led by António de Oliveira, was determined to maintain its empire, refusing to recognize the legitimacy of independence demands. As a result, when armed resistance broke out, Portugal responded with full-scale military operations to suppress the uprisings. In Angola, the war began with simultaneous attacks by multiple nationalist groups in 1961. The conflict escalated quickly, as guerrilla fighters employed ambush tactics and relied on rural support, while Portuguese forces used air power, counterinsurgency units, and harsh retaliatory measures. In Guinea-Bissau, the PAIGC African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde launched one of the most organized and effective resistance movements, building liberated zones and gaining international support. Mozambique saw the rise of Frelimo Front for the Liberation of Mozambique, which conducted cross-border operations and mobilized civilians into the resistance effort. Portugal, though technologically superior, was stretched thin across multiple fronts. Thousands of young Portuguese men were conscripted, and the economic burden of maintaining these wars became unsustainable. The government's refusal to negotiate or adapt politically deepened internal discontent. The wars not only drained Portugal's economy but also eroded morale at home, as more citizens questioned the ethics and viability of continuing colonial rule. Despite massive military efforts, Portugal failed to crush the independence movements. The growing cost of war, combined with rising opposition within the military, would eventually contribute to the revolutionary changes that unfolded in Portugal just a few years later. The Battle of Alcácer-Quibia, fought in 1578 in northern Morocco, was one of the most devastating military defeats in Portuguese history. King Sebastian I of Portugal led an ambitious expedition to Morocco with the aim of supporting a deposed ally, Sultan Abu Abdullah, and expanding Christian influence in North Africa. Sebastian, a young and zealous monarch, saw the campaign as both a religious crusade and a chance to establish himself as a warrior king. The Portuguese army, made up of around 17,000 men, included nobles, knights, and mercenaries, all confident in their mission and superiority. They were met by the powerful Moroccan forces of Sultan Abdi al-Malik, who had a larger and better organized army. Despite early confidence, the Portuguese underestimated the terrain, logistics, and strength of the Moroccan forces. On August 4, 1578, the two armies clashed near the town of Qasr el-Kibir. The battle was brutal and chaotic. Portuguese troops, unfamiliar with the harsh desert conditions and without reliable reinforcements or escape routes, were quickly overwhelmed. Thousands were killed, and many others were captured. Among the dead were King Sebastian himself, Sultan Abu Abdullah, and Sultan Abidi, who died of illness during the fighting. The death of King Sebastian without an heir led to a dynastic crisis in Portugal, known as the Sebastianic Crisis. It sparked uncertainty and political instability, eventually resulting in the Iberian Union, where Spain took control of Portugal in 1580 under King Philip II. This battle not only marked the end of Portugal's ambitions in Morocco, but also the decline of its political independence. The psychological impact of the defeat was immense. It gave rise to a lasting national myth that Sebastian would one day return to save Portugal in its time of need. A legend that lingered in Portuguese culture for centuries. Between 1807 and 1811, Portugal faced a series of invasions by Napoleon's forces during the Peninsular War, a conflict deeply tied to the larger Napoleonic Wars sweeping across Europe. Napoleon, aiming to enforce the continental system blockade meant to weaken Britain, economically ordered the invasion of Portugal, one of Britain's oldest allies. When Portugal refused to cut trade ties with the British, French troops under General Junot marched into the country. The Portuguese royal family, with British support, fled to Brazil, establishing the court in Rio de Janeiro, which briefly became the capital of the Portuguese Empire. The occupation was swift, but resistance began to build immediately, both from the population and from British and Portuguese military coordination. British forces under the Duke of Wellington, then Sir Arthur Wellesley, landed in Portugal to push back the French. The Anglo-Portuguese alliance was revived, leading to joint military campaigns that successfully repelled the invaders. The Portuguese army, initially weakened and disorganized, underwent reforms with British help, developing into a more effective fighting force. Local militias, known as ordenancas, played a key role in disrupting French supply lines and supporting guerrilla warfare. The geography of Portugal, with its rugged terrain, also helped hinder French movements. Major battles, such as Roliça and Vimeiro, marked early successes for the Allies. Over the next few years, 3 separate French invasions were launched, but each was eventually defeated. The fighting was fierce and destructive, causing widespread suffering among civilians. Cities were looted, farmlands destroyed, and populations displaced. However, these years also marked a strong sense of national resistance and military cooperation. The Peninsular War ultimately strengthened Portugal's ties with Britain and reasserted its sovereignty, laying the groundwork for future constitutional changes and the reestablishment of Portuguese independence after years of foreign threat. In 1974, Portugal underwent a profound political and military transformation through an event known as the Carnation Revolution. After decades under the Estado Novo dictatorship led by Antonio de Oliveira Salazar and later Marcelo Caetano, the country faced growing unrest. Portugal was isolated in Europe as one of the last remaining colonial empires, and its military campaigns in Africa had become deeply unpopular. The colonial wars in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau were draining the economy and costing thousands of Portuguese lives, many of them young conscripts. Dissatisfaction spread not only among civilians but also within the ranks of the military, especially among junior officers who were disillusioned with fighting endless wars in colonies demanding independence. These officers formed a secret movement, called the Armed Forces Movement, MFA, whose goal was to bring an end to the authoritarian regime and the colonial wars. On April 25, 1974, the MFA launched a peaceful military coup. Tanks rolled into Lisbon, but instead of bloodshed, soldiers were met with support from the public. Civilians placed red carnations in the barrels of rifles, a gesture that gave the revolution its name. The dictatorship collapsed quickly, and Marcelo Caetano surrendered to the military without resistance. The coup led to sweeping changes. Political prisoners were freed, censorship was abolished, and the path to democracy was set in motion. One of the first major outcomes was the decolonization of African territories. Recognizing the independence of nations like Angola and Mozambique, the military, which had long been an enforcer of colonial control, became the catalyst for democratic transition. The Carnation Revolution remains a symbol of peaceful change, showing how the military can play a role not in oppression, but in restoring freedom and justice. It marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new Portuguese identity. Asterisk, the history of Portugal's military attack wars is a story of ambition, struggle, and transformation. From the bold conquests of the Age of Exploration to the painful lessons of colonial resistance and the peaceful uprising of the Carnation Revolution, Portugal's military past reveals both its power and its vulnerability. These wars shaped not just borders and empires, but the very character of the nation, its courage, its mistakes, and its capacity to change. Through victories and defeats, the Portuguese people learned that true strength isn't only found on the battlefield, but in the ability to listen, to evolve, and to seek a more just and peaceful future. Asterisk.